I saw the chapel for the first time on a Tuesday afternoon in late September. The diocese had sent me out here with minimal explanation. Just a reassignment letter and directions to a township I'd never heard of, 3 hours from anywhere that mattered. The building sat at the end of a gravel road, surrounded by fields that had gone to seed. White paint peeled from the wooden siding in long, curling strips. The bell tower leaned slightly to the left, and several of the windows had been boarded over with plywood that had weathered to gray. It looked less like a house of God, and more like something God had forgotten about. I parked my car near the front steps and sat there for a minute, engine ticking as it cooled. This was my second chance, my last chance, really. After what happened in Bristol, I was lucky to still have a collar at all. The front door opened before I could reach it. A woman in her 70s stepped out, wiping her hands on an apron. She had the kind of face that had spent decades outdoors, lined and weathered but sharp-eyed. "Pastor Hale?" she asked. "That's right, you must be Sister Marianne." "Just Marianne is fine. I'm not part of any order, I just take care of the place." She looked me over with the critical eye of someone evaluating livestock. "You're younger than I expected. I'm 34. Like I said, younger." She stepped aside to let me in. "I've got the rectory prepared for you. It's small, but it's clean." The interior of the chapel was dim and smelled of old wood and damp earth. The pews were mostly empty, arranged in 2 short rows that faced a simple altar. No stained glass, no ornate decorations, just bare walls and exposed beams overhead. "How many attend services?" I asked. Marianne was already walking toward a side door. 12 on a good Sunday, sometimes less. Folks around here don't make the drive unless they have to." I followed her. "I see the rectory is through here." She led me down a narrow hallway and into a small apartment attached to the back of the chapel. 1 bedroom, a cramped kitchen, a sitting area with a threadbare couch. Everything looked like it had been furnished in the 70s and never updated. "It's perfect," I lied. Marianne set a key ring on the kitchen counter. "There's a grocery in town about 15 minutes east. I come by 3 times a week to tidy up and make sure everything's in order. If you need anything, I live just down the road." "Thank you. I appreciate all you've done to prepare for me." She looked at me for a long moment, her expression unreadable. "You should know something before you settle in." I waited. The chapel has its quirks, old buildings do. You'll hear things at night, settling beams, wind through the eaves, that sort of thing. That doesn't bother me. Good. She moved toward the door, then paused. "If you do hear anything unusual, just ignore it. You'll get used to it soon enough." It was an odd thing to say, but I didn't press her. I'd learned to pick my battles, especially with long-term parishioners who'd seen pastors come and go. After she left, I spent the rest of the afternoon unpacking. I didn't have much, a few boxes of books, some clothes, personal items. Everything I owned fit into my car. That's what happens when you leave a parish in disgrace. You travel light. By evening, I de-arranged everything as best I could. I made a simple dinner, ate it standing at the kitchen counter, and tried not to think about Bristol. Tried not to think about Sarah Mitchell and her parents and the letter from the bishop that had ended with permanent reassignment pending review of conduct. I'd done nothing wrong, but I'd done nothing right either, and in the church that was often worse. I went to bed around 10. The bedroom was small, with a single window that looked out over the dark fields. I lay there listening to the absolute silence of the countryside. No traffic, no voices, nothing but the occasional whisper of wind through the eaves, just like Marianne had said. I was almost asleep when I heard it. Singing, faint and distant, barely audible. Male voices, many of them layered in harmony. It sounded like plain chant, the kind of liturgical music you'd hear in a monastery, slow and measured and strangely beautiful. I sat up listening. The sound was definitely real. It was coming from somewhere below me, muffled but distinct. I checked my phone just past midnight. I got out of bed and walked through the apartment, trying to pinpoint the source. The singing was clearest in the sitting room near the door that led back into the chapel. I pressed my ear against the floorboards. The sound resonated through the wood, vibrating faintly against my skin. Someone was singing beneath the chapel. I thought about what Marianne had said. Old buildings have quirks, you'll hear things at night. But this wasn't wind through the eaves. This was human voices, multiple voices chanting in Latin. I considered investigating immediately, but something stopped me. Maybe it was the tone of Marianne's warning. Maybe it was simple exhaustion and the fact that this was my first night. and I didn't want to start my tenure here by overreacting to something that probably had a reasonable explanation. I went back to bed. The singing continued, steady and unceasing. It should have kept me awake, but instead it had the opposite effect. The rhythm was hypnotic, almost meditative. I found myself drifting off despite everything. When I woke the next morning, the singing had stopped. I found Marianne in the chapel dusting the pews. She looked up when I entered. "Sleep well?" she asked. "I heard singing last night coming from under the floor," her hands stilled on the cloth. "I told you, old buildings." It wasn't the building, it was people. Multiple voices chanting in Latin. She went back to dusting. "You'll get used to it." "Used to what exactly?" "The sounds. Like I said, the chapel has its quirks." "Marianne, I'm not an idiot. Someone is down there." She turned to face me, and for the first time I saw something hard in her expression. "Pastor Hale, I've been taking care of this chapel for 40 years. I know what's best for it. And what's best right now is for you to settle in, learn your congregation, and not go looking for problems that don't concern you. If there are people under this building, there are always people under churches," she interrupted. "They're called crypts. This is an old chapel. It has a crypt. Sometimes the acoustics carry sound in strange ways, that's all." It wasn't all. I could hear it in her voice, see it in the way she wouldn't quite meet my eyes, but I also knew I was in no position to push. I was here on sufferance, one more incident away from losing everything. "All right," I said. "I'll keep that in mind." She nodded and went back to her dusting. The conversation was over. I spent the rest of the day preparing for Sunday service. I wrote a sermon about second chances and new beginnings, which felt appropriately ironic given my situation. I familiarized myself with the chapel's layout, finding the vestry where the liturgical items were stored, the small sacristy where I could prepare for Mass. There was a door near the back of the vestry that I hadn't noticed before. It was made of old oak, scarred and weathered, with an iron lock that looked medieval. Strange symbols had been carved into the frame, worn smooth by time. I tried the handle, locked. "That's the old storage," Marianne said from behind me. I turned. She was standing in the doorway watching me. "What's stored down there?" "Old records, damaged furniture, things we don't need anymore." She came closer, her voice dropping. "It's not safe. The stairs are half-rotted. I keep it locked for insurance reasons." "I understand. Good." She smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. "I'm heading home for the day. I'll see you tomorrow." That night I lay awake waiting for the singing to start. It began at midnight exactly, as if triggered by some invisible signal. The same voices, the same plaintive chant resonating through the floorboards. I got up and walked through the apartment, following the sound. It was loudest near the door to the chapel. I went through into the main space, moving quietly in the darkness. The singing was definitely coming from below. I could feel it now, a faint vibration in the wood beneath my bare feet. Not just sound, but physical resonance, as if the entire structure was participating in whatever was happening beneath it. I made my way to the vestry and stood before the locked door. The singing was directly below me now, clear and unmistakable. Multiple male voices layered in complex harmony, chanting something I couldn't quite make out. I reached for the handle. It turned. The door swung open easily, revealing a narrow staircase descending into darkness. The singing welled up from below, no longer muffled, but clear and present and impossibly loud. I should have closed the door, should have locked it and walked away and pretended I'd never heard anything. Instead, I reached for the light switch on the wall. My hand found it, but when I flipped it, nothing happened. The bulb must have burned out. I stood there in the doorway, looking down into the darkness, listening to the voices below. They never wavered, never paused for breath, just continuous, unending song. The air rising from the stairwell was cold and smelled of old stone and something else, something organic and stale, like a space that hadn't been properly ventilated in a very long time. I took one step down, then another. The singing grew louder with each step, the harmonies separating into distinct voices. I counted at least a dozen, maybe more. Then the door behind me slammed shut. I spun around, heart hammering. The vestry light visible through the crack under the door vanished, plunging me into complete darkness. I fumbled for my phone, but I'd left it in the apartment. The singing continued below me, indifferent to my panic. I climbed back up the stairs and pushed against the door. It didn't budge. The handle turned freely, but the door itself was stuck, as if something heavy had been placed against it on the other side. "Hello," I called. "Is someone there?" No answer, just the singing growing louder, pressing in from all sides. I stood there in the dark, trapped between the locked door above and the unknown below, and realized I'd made a terrible mistake. I stood there for what felt like an hour but was probably only a few minutes. The singing never stopped, never changed rhythm. It just continued, relentless and inhuman in its consistency. Eventually, I tried the door again. This time it opened easily, swinging outward without resistance. The vestry was exactly as I'd left it, empty and undisturbed. Nothing had been blocking it. I stepped through and closed the door behind me, leaning against it while my heart rate settled. My hands were shaking. I told myself it was just an old door, swollen wood catching in the frame, releasing when the pressure changed. Old buildings do that, but I didn't believe it. I went back to the apartment and spent the rest of the night sitting on the couch, lights on, waiting for dawn. The singing continued until around 4 in the morning, then stopped abruptly, cut off mid-phrase like someone had flipped a switch. When Marianne arrived the next morning, I was waiting for her in the chapel. "We need to talk," I said. She set down her cleaning supplies. "About what? About what's under this building? I already told you. You told me it was acoustics. That was a lie." "I went to the door last night. I heard them, multiple voices chanting. That's not acoustics." She stared at me for a long moment, then sighed. "You shouldn't have gone down there." "I didn't. The door closed on me before I could." Something flickered in her expression, relief maybe. "Good, then we don't have a problem." "Marianne, I'm the pastor here. If there are people in the crypt, they're not your concern. Everything in this chapel is my concern." She picked up her cleaning supplies and started toward the pews. "The diocese sent you here because you have a problem with boundaries. That's what I was told. Maybe this is your chance to learn where those boundaries are." The words hit harder than they should have. "Who told you that? Does it matter?" She looked at me and her expression softened slightly. "Pastor Hale, I'm trying to help you. This position is your last chance. I know that. You know that. The best thing you can do is focus on your congregation and let the rest alone." "I can't do that if I don't understand what's happening here." "You don't need to understand it. You just need to accept it." She walked away, and I didn't follow. I spent the rest of the morning in my apartment trying to work on my sermon and failing. My mind kept returning to the door, the stairs, the voices below. That night I waited until the singing started. Then I took a flashlight from my car, went to the vestry, and opened the door. The singing rose up to meet me, clear and resonant. I descended the stairs slowly, keeping the flashlight beam pointed at my feet. The steps were stone, worn smooth in the centers from centuries of use. They curved as they descended, spiraling down into the earth. The air grew colder with each step. The smell intensified. Old incense, damp stone, and something else I couldn't identify, something organic. The staircase opened into a corridor, long and narrow, with a vaulted stone ceiling that disappeared into shadow above my flashlight beam. The walls were lined with alcoves, each one about 7 feet tall and 3 feet wide. And in each alcove stood a figure. I stopped walking. They were men or had been dressed in monks' robes that had faded to a uniform gray. Their faces were visible in the dim light, skin pulled tight over skull bones, lips cracked and colorless. But their mouths moved, each one of them chanting in perfect synchronization, their voices layered and overlapping to create the hymn I'd been hearing. I counted 12 alcoves on this section of wall. 12 monks, each one sealed into their space by bars of rusted iron that had been set into the stone. I approached the nearest one slowly. The monk's eyes were open but unfocused, staring at nothing. His mouth moved continuously, forming Latin words I couldn't understand. His breathing was shallow, barely visible in the rise and fall of his chest. "Hello," I said. He didn't react, just kept chanting. I reached out and touched the iron bars. They were cold, almost painfully so. The monk behind them didn't acknowledge my presence in any way. I moved to the next alcove. Same thing. The monk chanted, mouth moving mechanically, eyes vacant. I checked the third, the fourth, all of them identical, alive but not present, locked in some kind of trance. My flashlight beam swept along the corridor, revealing more alcoves, at least 20, maybe 30. All of them occupied, all of them chanting. The corridor ended in a wall, not brick or wood, but a single massive stone slab, taller and wider than a door, set into the earth itself. Symbols had been carved into its surface, the same strange markings I'd seen on the vestry door. The stone was trembling, a barely perceptible vibration that I felt more than saw. I stood there trying to process what I was seeing. These men were alive, impossibly old, impossibly thin, but alive. How long had they been down here? How were they surviving? A voice spoke from behind me. I told you not to come down here. I spun around. Marianne stood at the base of the stairs holding a candle. The flame cast shadows across her face, making her look older, harder. What is this? I asked. It's what keeps us safe. Safe from what? She walked closer, moving between the alcoves without looking at them, as if they were furniture she'd grown used to. This chapel was built in 1823, but the crypt is older, much older. The chapel was built on top of it because someone needed to maintain what was here. The monks, they're not monks, not anymore. They gave up that title a long time ago. She stopped a few feet from the sealed stone. They're singers now, that's all they are, that's all they can be. How long have they been here? I don't know. Generations, maybe longer. She turned to look at me. Each one came here knowing what would be required of them. They took their place in the alcoves willingly. This is insane. They need medical attention, food, water. They don't need anything except to keep singing. Marianne, these are human beings. They were human beings, now there's something else, something necessary. Her voice was patient, like she was explaining simple arithmetic to a child. The hymn they're singing, it's not just music, it's a binding. It holds something back. I looked at the sealed stone. What's behind there? I don't know, I've never seen it, no one alive has, but I know what happens when the singing stops. She gestured to the alcoves. 3 years ago, one of them died. His voice dropped out of the hymn for maybe 30 seconds before the others compensated. In that time, the entire chapel shook, windows cracked, the bell in the tower rang on its own. I thought the whole building was going to come down. That could be an earthquake. It wasn't an earthquake. She met my eyes. You felt it when you were on the stairs, that pressure, like the walls were breathing. I had felt it. I'd been trying to convince myself it was claustrophobia, panic, anything rational, but she was right. The stone around us felt alive, pulsing with some kind of presence. This is impossible, I said. You're standing in a crypt full of men who have been singing the same hymn for decades without stopping. What part of your situation feels possible? I didn't have an answer for that. The diocese knows, Marianne continued. They've always known. Why do you think they send priests out here? Someone needs to maintain the chapel, perform services, keep up appearances. But the real purpose is to make sure no one interferes with what's happening down here. They sent me because I made a mistake, because they wanted to bury me somewhere I couldn't cause more problems. Maybe, or maybe they sent you because you're the kind of person who follows rules, who understands duty. She moved toward the stairs. You've seen it now. You know what's required. The only question is whether you can accept it and do your job, or whether you're going to make this more difficult than it needs to be. I looked at the monks, at their moving mouths and empty eyes. What happens when they die? All of them. Someone takes their place. The words hung in the cold air between us. That's not going to be me, I said. I hope not, she replied, but someone has to be ready. She started up the stairs. Come on, you should rest. Sunday service is tomorrow, and your congregation will expect you to be present. I followed her up, casting one last look at the corridor of alcoves. As I watched, one of the monks' voices wavered slightly, just a fraction of a second where the note didn't hold. The sound was barely noticeable in the layered harmony, but I caught it. The stone walls contracted just once, like a breath being held. Then the monk's voice steadied, the harmony restored, and the pressure released. I climbed the stairs and didn't look back. That night I lay in bed listening to the hymn and trying to convince myself there was a rational explanation. Sleep deprivation, carbon monoxide, some kind of shared delusion that Marianne and I were both experiencing. But I knew better. I'd felt it, that presence behind the stone pressing against its prison, testing the bonds that held it. Around 3 in the morning I heard it again, one voice in the hymn cracking, the notes splitting and faltering. This time it lasted longer, 2 seconds, maybe 3. The floorboards beneath me trembled. A picture frame fell off the wall in the sitting room. Then the voice recovered and everything stilled. I got out of bed and went to the window. The fields beyond were dark and empty. The moon was thin, barely providing any light. But I could see the chapel, the crooked bell tower silhouetted against the sky. And I could hear, even through the closed window, the sound of the hymn rising from beneath the floorboards, constant, unending, eternal. One of them was failing. I didn't know how I knew, but I was certain of it. One of the singers was reaching the end of his endurance, and when his voice gave out completely, something would have to give. I thought about what Marianne had said. Someone takes their place. I went back to bed, but I didn't sleep. I just lay there listening to the hymn, waiting for another crack in the harmony that I knew would eventually come. Sunday service was small, 11 people scattered among the pews, most of them over 60. They sang the hymns poorly and listened to my sermon with polite disinterest. Afterward, they shook my hand and welcomed me with the kind of warmth reserved for temporary fixtures, pleasant enough, but without investment. I spent the afternoon in my apartment trying to work on next week's sermon and failing. My mind kept returning to the crypt, to those men sealed in stone, their mouths moving in endless repetition. The singing started early that night, not at midnight, but around 10, as if it couldn't wait. And it sounded different, thinner somehow, like an instrument slightly out of tune. I lay in bed listening. There, that voice again, the one that had been wavering. It was weaker now, the note not quite reaching the pitch it needed. The other voices compensated, adjusting their harmony to cover the gap, but I could still hear it, a weakness in the foundation. Around 11 it happened. One voice simply stopped. The absence was immediate and absolute. Where there had been layered harmony, now there was a hole, a silence that the other voices couldn't quite fill. The hymn continued, but it sounded incomplete, like a gear missing from a machine. The floorboards beneath me began to shake. It wasn't violent at first, just a subtle vibration, the kind you might feel standing near train tracks. But it built quickly, growing stronger with each passing second. The bed frame rattled. The lamp on the nightstand wobbled. I got up and moved to the doorway, bracing myself against the frame. The shaking intensified. Pictures fell from the walls. In the kitchen, I heard glasses tumbling from the cabinet and shattering on the floor. Then, as suddenly as it started, it stopped. The silence that followed was worse than the shaking, total and complete, broken only by the incomplete hymn still rising from below. The other voices had adjusted again, spreading out to fill the gap, but the absence was still audible. I grabbed my flashlight and went down to the crypt. The monks were still chanting, their mouths moving in mechanical synchronization. But as I walked along the corridor, I saw it, one alcove where the monk's head had slumped forward, chin against chest. His mouth was still open, but no sound came out. His chest wasn't moving. I approached slowly. The iron bars were ice-cold against my palm. The monk's skin had taken on a waxy quality, gray and lifeless. He'd been barely alive before, but now there was no question. He was gone. The other monks continued their chant, apparently unaware or unconcerned that one of their number had failed. I turned toward the sealed stone at the end of the corridor. It was moving, not much, just a faint rhythmic pulsing, like something massive breathing on the other side. The symbols carved into its surface seemed darker somehow, as if they'd absorbed the shadows around them. And I could hear something, a sound beneath the hymn, deep and resonant, not quite a voice, but not quite not a voice either. The stone shuddered, dust sifted down from the ceiling. I backed away, keeping my flashlight trained on the sealed wall. The pulsing continued, steady and patient. Whatever was behind there knew something had changed. It was testing the barrier, probing for weakness. I turned and ran up the stairs. Marianne was in the chapel, standing in the center aisle, looking up at the ceiling. Several of the boards had cracked, thin splits running across their length. "You felt it," I said. She nodded. "Marcus is gone. He held on longer than I expected." "Marcus, the one who died. I never spoke to him, but I've been keeping track." She looked at me. "There are 23 left now." 23 voices holding back what's behind that stone. "This is insane. We need to call someone, the diocese, the police, someone. And tell them what? That there are monks in the basement singing to hold back an ancient god." She shook her head. "They already know, Pastor. The ones who need to know, the rest would just think we're crazy. Then we need to get them out of there, get them medical attention. They're beyond medical attention. Most of them have been down there for 50 years or more. They're alive because the hymn keeps them alive. If you take them out of the alcoves, they'll die within minutes." I wanted to argue, but I couldn't. I'd seen their condition. Whatever was sustaining them wasn't food or water or anything medical science could provide. "What happens when they all die?" I asked. "Someone takes their place. You keep saying that. Who? How?" She walked toward the vestry door. "Come with me." I followed her down to the crypt. The monks continued their chant, their voices echoing off the stone walls. Marianne led me past Marcus's alcove, past the others, all the way to the far end of the corridor. There were 3 alcoves here that I hadn't noticed before, empty alcoves, their iron bars open, waiting. "When someone is ready," Marianne said, "they enter willingly." The moment they start singing the hymn, the alcove seals. The stone closes around them, the bars lock into place, and they become part of the choir. Ready? What does that mean? It means they understand what's required. That they're willing to give up their life, their future, everything to keep the barrier intact. She paused. It means they have faith. Faith in what? In duty, in sacrifice, in the idea that some things are worth any cost to prevent. She gestured to the sealed stone. I don't know what's behind there, but I know our world can't survive if it gets out. Every person who's taken an alcove knew that. They chose this. I looked at the empty spaces. You're saying I need to be ready to do the same. I'm saying someone does, and right now you're the only candidate. No, the word came out harder than I intended. I came here to be a pastor, to serve a congregation, not to what? To spend the rest of your life chanting in the dark. She met my eyes. I understand, it's not fair, none of this is fair, but fairness doesn't enter into it. There has to be another way. If there is, no one else found it in 200 years. We stood there in silence, surrounded by the chanting monks and the cold stone and the presence pressing against the sealed wall. Finally, Marianne spoke again. You don't have to decide tonight. But you should start learning the hymn, just in case. In case what? In case more of them fail, in case the barrier breaks before you're ready. She started back toward the stairs. I'll write out the words for you. The melody you'll have to learn by ear. It's in Latin, from a much older liturgy than anything in common use. I didn't follow her immediately. I stood there looking at the empty alcoves, trying to imagine myself sealed behind those bars, mouth moving in endless repetition while my body withered and my mind fractured. I couldn't do it. I wouldn't do it. But even as I thought that, I heard another voice in the hymn waver, just for a moment, a fraction of a second where the note didn't quite land. And I felt the walls contract, the pressure building, something vast and patient testing the limits of its prison. I went back upstairs and found Marianne in the vestry writing on a piece of paper. She handed it to me when she was done, Latin words phonetically spelled out with notes about pronunciation and emphasis. At the top she'd written, Hymn of the Threshold. Practice it, she said. Even if you never need to use it, you should know it, just in case. I took the paper and went back to my apartment. I sat at the kitchen table looking at the words, trying to match them to the melody rising through the floorboards. It was hypnotic, that melody, simple on the surface but layered with complexity. Each voice weaving in and out of the others to create something that was more than music, something functional, like a lock or a chain. I found myself humming along, following the rhythm, shaping the Latin words with my mouth. The hymn pulled at something inside me, not forcing, but inviting, like a door standing open, waiting for me to choose whether to step through. I stopped humming and put the paper down. I wasn't going to do this. I would find another way. There had to be another way. Around 2 in the morning I heard it, a crack, sharp and clear like a tree branch splitting in winter. I went to the window and looked out at the chapel. Nothing seemed wrong from the outside, but I could feel it, a change in the air, a tension that hadn't been there before. I grabbed my flashlight and went down to the crypt. The monks were still chanting, but their voices sounded strained now, stretched thin. I moved past them to the sealed stone. A crack ran down its center, thin but distinct, splitting the stone from top to bottom. And through that crack I could see movement. Not light, not shadow, but something else, something that hurt to look at directly. The stone pulsed and the crack widened, just a fraction of an inch, but enough. Enough to let through a sound. A voice, too deep, too layered. It spoke a single word in a language I didn't recognize. The monks' voices rose in response, the hymn intensifying, pouring everything they had into maintaining the barrier. The crack stopped widening, held in place by the sound. But I could see the strain in their faces now, the way their mouths worked desperately to keep the notes pure and sustained. They were failing, not all at once, but gradually, inevitably. And when they failed completely, that crack would split open, and whatever was behind it would be free. I stood there in the cold dark, listening to the hymn and the voice beneath it, and I knew Marianne was right. Someone would have to take the alcove. Someone would have to sacrifice everything to keep that door closed. And I was running out of time to accept that it might have to be me. I spent the next 3 days learning the hymn. Marianne had been right. The melody was simple on the surface, but impossibly complex in practice. Each voice carried a different thread, and they had to interweave perfectly or the whole structure collapsed. I practiced alone in my apartment, humming along with the voices below, trying to match their rhythm and pitch. The Latin came easier than I expected. Years of seminary training had left me with enough of the language to parse the meaning. It wasn't a prayer exactly, more like an invocation, a continuous statement of binding. The same phrases repeated over and over: you shall not pass, you shall not rise, you shall remain below. On Thursday night, 2 more monks died. I was in the chapel when it happened, reviewing the order of service for Sunday. The hymn faltered, 2 voices dropping out almost simultaneously. The building shook so violently that I had to grip the edge of a pew to stay upright. The stained glass window above the altar, the one that had somehow survived 2 centuries, cracked down the middle. When the shaking stopped, I ran down to the crypt. The 2 monks hung limp in their alcoves, heads bowed, mouths slack. The remaining 21 voices struggled to compensate, but the hymn sounded thin now, desperate. The crack in the sealed stone had widened. I could fit my fingers into it if I wanted to. I didn't want to. The presence behind the stone was more active now. I could hear it moving, not footsteps exactly, but something massive shifting its weight, repositioning itself, testing different parts of the barrier, looking for the weakest point. Marianne appeared beside me, breathing hard from the climb down. She looked older than she had a week ago, her face gray and deeply lined. 21 left, she said. How long do they have? Days, maybe less. She touched the wall, feeling the vibrations. It knows they're failing, it's pushing harder now. Then we evacuate the town, get everyone out of here before what? Before it breaks free. She shook her head. You don't understand the scale. If that barrier falls, it won't stop at this town. It won't stop at this state. Whatever's behind there has been imprisoned since before this country existed. The amount of rage, the amount of hunger. She stopped, steadying herself against the wall. We don't evacuate, she said. We maintain. With what? We're down to 21 singers and they're dying. Then you learn faster. I went back to my apartment and practiced. I sang along with the hymn until my throat was raw, until I could hold the notes without thinking, until the Latin words flowed automatically. I didn't sleep, couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that crack in the stone widening. Friday morning, another monk died. 20 voices now. The hymn was noticeably weaker, the harmonies incomplete. The chapel groaned constantly, wooden beams shifting and settling in ways that had nothing to do with temperature or weather. Several floor planks had warped upward, creating trip hazards in the aisles. I found Marianne in the vestry trying to sort through old records. Her hands were shaking. You need to rest, I said. I'll rest when this is over. You're going to collapse. Then I collapse. She looked up at me and I saw the exhaustion in her eyes. I've been preparing for this for 40 years, Pastor Hale, every night listening to that hymn, knowing it was the only thing standing between us and the end of everything. I'm not going to fail now. Marianne, you need to be ready today, tonight at the latest. She pushed a leather-bound book toward me. This has the full liturgy, not just the hymn, but the ritual of entry, what you need to do, what you need to say when you take the alcove. I looked at the book but didn't touch it. I haven't agreed to this. You will, you have to. She stood up, swaying slightly. I wish there was another way. I've prayed for another way for 40 years, but there isn't one. There's just duty, there's just sacrifice. She walked past me, heading toward the chapel. I heard her footsteps, uneven and slow, then a heavy thud. I found her collapsed in the center aisle, unconscious. Her breathing was shallow, her pulse thready. I called for an ambulance, but I knew what had happened. The stress, the sleepless nights, the constant terror. It had finally broken her. The paramedics took her away 30 minutes later. One of them, a woman in her 40s, looked around the chapel as they wheeled the gurney out. This place feels wrong, she said. It's old, I replied. It's not that. She glanced at the cracked window, the warped floorboards. It feels like it's sick, like the building itself is dying. She wasn't wrong. After they left, I stood alone in the chapel, listening to the hymn below, 20 voices growing weaker by the hour. I could hear the strain now, the way each singer pushed to maintain their note, to keep the harmony intact. How long until the next one failed? How long until the crack split wide and whatever was behind it forced its way through? I went down to the crypt. The monks looked worse than before. Their skin had taken on a translucent quality, stretched so tight over bones that I could see the outline of their skulls. But their mouths still moved, still shaped the Latin words with mechanical precision. I walked to the empty alcoves at the end of the corridor. The iron bars stood open, waiting. The stone walls were bare except for carved symbols matching the ones on the sealed door. The space was just wide enough for a person to stand, not wide enough to sit or lie down. I tried to imagine spending eternity here, standing in this narrow space, chanting the same words over and over while my body withered and my mind fragmented. I couldn't do it. The thought was impossible, inhuman. I had come here to serve God, not to become a living sacrifice to some ancient horror, but I was the only one left. Marianne was gone, the monks were dying, and the barrier was failing. I heard the crack again, that sharp splitting sound. I turned toward the sealed stone. The crack had widened to nearly 2 inches, and through it I saw something move, not darkness, not light, but something else. Something that existed in a space between, something that shouldn't be perceived by human eyes. It spoke again, that same deep, layered voice forming words in a language that predated Latin, predated English, predated anything I recognized. But I understood it anyway, in the same way you understand a scream or a laugh. It was making a promise. The stone would fall, the barrier would break. And it would be free. The monks' voices rose in response, desperate now, pouring everything they had into the hymn. But I could hear them failing, individual notes cracking and splitting. They were at their limit. I walked back up to my apartment and found the leather-bound book Marianne had given me. The ritual of entry was surprisingly simple. Enter the alcove. Begin the hymn, do not stop, that was it. No special preparation, no ceremonial requirements, just commitment, just sacrifice. I read through the entire book looking for some other option, some escape clause. There was none. The binding required constant sound, constant intention, constant presence. The moment the hymn stopped, the barrier would fail. I sat there for a long time holding the book, thinking about my life, about the choices I'd made, the mistakes, the small failures that had led me here. I'd been sent to this chapel as punishment, as exile. The diocese wanted me buried somewhere I couldn't cause more problems. Maybe this was the problem I was meant to solve. Maybe this was the only thing I'd ever been meant for. I went back down to the crypt around midnight. The hymn was ragged now, barely holding together. As I watched, another monk's voice cracked and fell silent. His head slumped forward. 19 voices. The sealed stone pulsed and the crack widened another inch. Dust rained down from the ceiling. In the distance, I heard the chapel's bell ring once, though no one had touched it. I walked to the empty alcove. The iron bars were cold under my palms. The space inside was exactly as narrow as I'd remembered, just wide enough to stand, not wide enough to turn around. The stone walls were smooth, worn by centuries of bodies pressing against them. I stepped inside. The moment my feet crossed the threshold, I felt it, a pulling sensation like hooks catching in my chest and shoulders, drawing me deeper into the alcove. The iron bars swung closed behind me with a sound like a coffin lid shutting. I opened my mouth to scream, but what came out was the hymn. The words flowed automatically, shaped by my lips without conscious thought. My voice joined the others, weaving into the harmony, filling the gap left by the failed monks. The Latin syllables burned in my throat, each one scraping against my vocal cords like broken glass, but the hymn held. I felt the stone wall against my back, solid and unyielding. My feet were planted on the floor, unable to move. My arms hung at my sides, frozen in place. Only my mouth was free, and it moved with mechanical precision, shaping the words of the binding over and over and over. The crack in the sealed stone stopped widening. The presence behind it raged. I could feel its fury like heat against my face, but it couldn't push through. The hymn held it back, 20 voices now working in perfect synchronization. I tried to stop singing, tried to close my mouth to break the rhythm, to escape this nightmare I'd walked into willingly, but I couldn't. My voice continued without me, autonomous and relentless. The hymn had taken root in my throat, in my lungs, in the deepest part of my brain. It was all I was now, all I would ever be again. The other monks' faces swam in my vision, gray and lifeless and enduring. Now I understood their empty eyes, their mechanical movements. They weren't people anymore. They were vessels for the hymn, hollow instruments playing a single endless note. And I had joined them. My throat burned, my lungs ached. But the hymn continued, pouring out of me in an unbroken stream, reinforcing the barrier, holding back the ancient god that pressed against its prison. I wanted to weep, to scream, to rage against what I'd become. But all I could do was sing. Time stopped meaning anything. I couldn't tell if I'd been singing for hours or days. The crypt had no windows, no natural light, just the constant darkness broken by the faint glow of whatever force animated the alcoves. My voice continued without pause, without variation, merged into the collective hymn that held the barrier intact. The other monks died around me. I felt each one go, not because I saw them, I couldn't turn my head, couldn't move my eyes from their fixed position staring straight ahead, but because I heard their voices drop out of the harmony. One by one, the threads of the hymn unraveled. 20 voices became 19. 19 became 17. 17 became 12. Each time a voice failed, the pressure increased. The sealed stone groaned. The presence behind it pushed harder, testing the weakening barrier with patient, relentless force. And each time the remaining voices had to work harder to compensate. My throat felt like it was lined with razor blades. My lungs burned with every breath. But the hymn continued, pouring out of me in an endless stream. I tried to track the passage of time by counting repetitions of the liturgy, but I lost count somewhere around 300. Or was it 3,000? The numbers blurred together, meaningless. My body was failing. I could feel it happening in slow motion, muscles atrophying, bones hollowing, skin tightening against my skull. I was becoming like the others, a dried husk animated only by the hymn. Part of me was horrified. Part of me was grateful. The less human I became, the less I could feel the agony of what I was doing. 10 voices left, then 8, then 5. The sealed stone cracked again, not the same crack as before. This was new, running horizontally across the middle. The two cracks formed a cross now, and through the intersection I could see movement, something massive, something that defied the geometry of the space behind the stone, pressing against its prison. It spoke again, not words this time, but a sound that bypassed my ears and went straight into my brain. A promise and a threat and a command all at once. The remaining monks' voices wavered. 3 voices left, then 2, then just me. The last monk died sometime during what might have been the 3rd day or the 3rd week. I couldn't tell anymore. His voice simply stopped mid-syllable, and the silence that followed was absolute. I was alone. The hymn should have collapsed. One voice couldn't sustain the complexity of the binding, couldn't hold all the threads of the harmony that had been maintained by dozens. The barrier should have fallen immediately. But somehow, impossibly, my voice split. I could hear it happening. My single voice fracturing into multiple tones, creating harmonies that shouldn't be possible from one throat. The alcove was doing something to me, amplifying my song, bending it into the shape required by the ritual. But the cost was devastating. My throat tore. I felt something rupture deep inside my chest. Blood filled my mouth, warm and copper-tasting, but the hymn continued through it, using the blood as lubricant, incorporating it into the sound. The sealed stone began to open, not quickly, not explosively, but slowly, inevitably, the cracks widening as the entity behind them pushed forward. I could see it now, not clearly, never clearly, but in fragments and impressions. Something vast, something older than the stone that imprisoned it. Something that had been patient for so long that a few more moments meant nothing. It was testing me, seeing how long I could hold, how much pain I could endure before my voice finally broke. I pushed harder. I forced the hymn through my ruined throat, through my collapsed lungs, through vocal cords that should have been shredded beyond function. The sound that came out was barely human anymore, more like grinding stone than singing, but it held the shape of the liturgy. It held the binding. The stone stopped opening for a moment. Everything hung in balance, the entity's pressure against the barrier, my voice holding it back. Equal forces, neither able to overcome the other. Then I felt something shift inside me, not physically, deeper than that. Something fundamental, something that made me who I was, breaking loose and reforming into something else. The last piece of Rowan Hale burning away, leaving only the hymn behind. I accepted it. I stopped fighting, stopped clinging to the person I used to be. I let the ritual take everything, my memories, my identity, my hope for anything beyond this moment. And the hymn stabilized. My voice, if it could still be called mine, settled into a rhythm that was sustainable. Not easy, not painless, but sustainable. The multiple harmonies I was somehow producing locked together, creating the complex binding the ritual required. The sealed stone stopped moving. The cracks remained, but they didn't widen. The entity behind them raged and pushed, but it couldn't break through, because I wouldn't let it. I don't know how long I've been singing. Time doesn't exist here, not in any meaningful way. There's just the hymn, eternal and unchanging, and my voice carrying it forward. Sometimes I think I hear footsteps above me. Maybe the diocese sent another pastor to replace me. Maybe they're looking for me, wondering where I went, but I can't call out to them. Can't warn them, can only sing. Sometimes I think I feel the alcove shifting, preparing to release me, but that's just wishful thinking. The ritual doesn't end. Once you take the alcove, you're part of it forever, or at least until your voice finally breaks and someone else takes your place. I used to wonder what would happen if no one came, if I died and no replacement was ready, if the hymn finally stopped after centuries of continuous sound. I don't wonder anymore, because I've seen what's behind that stone. I've felt its hunger, its rage, its absolute certainty that it will eventually be free. It doesn't matter if it takes 10 years or 1,000. It has time, more time than any human can comprehend. All it needs is for the hymn to stop, so I sing. My throat is ruined. My lungs are failing. My body is a dried husk barely held together by the ritual. But my voice continues, splitting into impossible harmonies, maintaining the binding that holds the barrier closed. I don't think about rescue anymore, don't think about escape. Don't think about the life I used to have, the person I used to be. There's just the hymn, just the endless repetition of Latin words worn smooth by centuries of use. Just the knowledge that as long as I'm singing, the world above continues unaware of what I'm holding back. Sometimes, rarely, in moments when the hymn allows a fraction of conscious thought, I remember arriving at the chapel. Remember thinking this was my last chance, my opportunity for redemption. I was right about that, at least. This is my redemption. This is my purpose. This is everything I was meant for, distilled down to its purest form. The entity pushes against the stone. I push back with sound. It tests the cracks. I reinforce them with harmony. It whispers promises of freedom, of rest, of silence. I answer with the hymn. My voice cracks sometimes, not often, but it happens. When it does, I feel the stone shift, feel the entity surge forward, and I force the hymn back into place, screaming it through destroyed vocal cords, bleeding it out of a ruined throat, because I can't stop. Because if I stop, everything ends. Because this is what I am now, not a pastor, not a man, just a voice in the dark singing the same words forever, holding back the thing that waits behind the stone. I used to pray for salvation. Now I pray my voice never cracks.